Hello, everyone. I hope, can you all hear me now? Yes, good. All right. So thank you very much. I'm very sorry for the connection problems. Um, I hope, I don't know how much you have heard from what I was briefing in the beginning. We are extremely excited to have you here today, and as well because it has been a while that MHPSS.net we 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 didn't have webinars for this second semester, so we are very glad to finish the year with this webinar. So I just want to greet our presenters, Frederica Bombenzer. So I'm sorry, Frederica, if I pronounced your name not in the correct way, and as well Patrick Onyango. They are going to introduce themselves quickly about the work that they do and who they are. And I want to hand over this now to you, Frederica. Let's just make sure that we can hear you as well. I'm sorry for the brief introduction, but I'm having here some connection issues, I just want to make sure that we start this straight away and no more delays.
Hi, Marcio. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. Yes, it's all yours. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, Marcio, and thank you to 80 people from 20 countries around the world. It's really, really exciting. I love this technology. I find it incredible to be able to sit here and connect with you all on something that I'm incredibly passionate about. I work for the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, South Africa. We were formed after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and work on transitional justice and peace building issues here in South Africa as well as around the world. Patrick and I are going to be talking to you both, Patrick after me in a moment, about integrating mental health and psychosocial support and peace building. Marcio, I don't think we can see my presentation yet. I wonder if we can maybe get that up and running. I see it now. Okay, wonderful. So a little bit of background as to why this is necessary, and I'll sort of rewind a little bit further on about how this work started at IJR. So as those of you who are working, and I can see most of you are working in conflict-affected or post-conflict countries around the world, violent conflict has a significant but often under-acknowledged impact on human beings. It weakens the social fabric, people's capacity for recovery and their willingness and ability to participate in social recovery processes is limited. So we tend to rebuild infrastructure, we rebuild and prioritize hospitals, schools, roads, cities. We prioritize early childhood development, women's issues, the disabled. What we quite rarely are still looking at is the psychological impact that violent conflict has on people. We also know that after conflict, the causes of conflict often remain and continue to foster mistrust and fear. So just because we've signed a peace agreement or there's been a peace process doesn't mean that the issues that caused the conflict in the first place have discontinued. And this is something that here in South Africa we see a lot increasingly. Both MHPSS professionals as well as peace builders aim ultimately to restore relationships and the social fabric that binds and supports people within their communities as a way of disrupting cycles of violence and building sustainable peace. And this is, I think, really important to think of the work that we're doing as ultimately, very ultimately, in many different ways, having this major issue in common, that we're restoring relationships and rebuilding social fabric. Of course, each field has different ways of achieving its goals, but there are major overlaps. But what we have found in our work is that despite these overlaps and despite these similarities, the two fields are working mostly in isolation from one another. And we know this partially anecdotally from conversations that we've had with many of you who are on this chat, but also other organizations around the world. But we also know this because we have conducted a mapping study. It's 2 years ago now. I often think that we should perhaps reconduct that study to get a sense of the extent to which we are working together. but by and large, the majority of international organizations aren't working in an integrated way, and often are referring their work to other organizations, or are not collaborating at all. And so what IJR is trying to do is to develop a model that integrates mental health and psychosocial support and peace building in order to develop sustainable long-term solutions to countries that are affected by conflict. So many of you on this chat, I think, are from an MHPSS background. And since I'm from an MHPSS background, and Patrick, who's speaking after me, comes from I'm from a peace building background, and Patrick after me is speaking from an MHPSS perspective, I just wanted to very briefly outline who we are and what we do, and why MHPSS is so important to our work. So peace building is interdisciplinary in nature, both in its nature and in terms of the approach and in terms of the professional backgrounds of the individuals that work in the field. We are everything from economists to anthropologists to political scientists, artists, and various other people. We build on available local strengths, resources, and cultural riches. And we do this all in order to rebuild societies, communities, and individuals at a micro, meso, and macro level that have been affected by conflict. Our principles are do no harm, impartiality, inclusivity, to be participatory. We often mostly aim for long-term goals and objectives. We have a multiplicity of possible entry points. Our work is transformative, and non-violence is key to the way in which we work. The tools and methodologies which we use are conflict analysis, so understanding the root causes of conflict and what has driven a conflict to escalate the way it has, using mediation, using negotiation, using facilitation skills. Dialogue is absolutely critical to peace building work, especially at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. We use storytelling, digital storytelling, oral history, all of those sort of tools that are related to this. We use art, we use sports, and various other tools and methodologies. Some of the concepts that are sort of prominent in the work that we do are understanding cycles of violence, understanding where violence begins, where it ends, and the effects, impacts, and influencing factors on the way. We talk about direct, cultural, and structural violence, which are different forms of violence which impact people in different ways, either physically, directly to the body, or structurally in terms of daily stresses, poverty, inequality, oppression, marginalization. We look at peace ecologically as a system, and peace and justice, or the peace and justice debate that falls loosely into the transitional justice debate, is part of the work that we also look into, and that comprises truth-telling, the balance between punitive and restorative justice, reparations work, memorialization, reconciliation, and then this term healing, which I imagine many of the MHPSS people listening to me now will think, "Ooh, what do they know about healing?" But I'll come to that in a little bit. So why have we started doing this reach out to the MHPSS field? Perhaps it's interesting just to say that I've been at IJR for 11 or 12 years, and when I joined the organization, I should slow down. Yes, I should slow down. There were no overt projects or programs, or indeed staff with qualifications on MHPSS issues that were working on how the psychological legacy of apartheid was sort of impacting on the work that we were doing as a peace building and reconciliation organization. What I noticed during the course of my work is that as soon as we started talking in the peace building space around issues related to mental health, and how conflicts in all of the countries that we worked on had affected people, we realized that people's readiness and willingness to reconcile is severely reduced when people's trauma, when their memories of the past, which in many cases are traumatized, are not sufficiently addressed. And we see here in South Africa that not addressing these memories, not addressing the trauma that is so widespread, not addressing the daily stresses that people live in, can have a really detrimental effect on the way communities live in the aftermath of conflict. And the bottom line really was that we don't have the tools or the knowledge to respond adequately to these needs as peace builders. And so gradually we started reaching out to organizations that were working in the MHPSS realm. And increasingly we started realizing that in order to do our work better as peace builders, we needed to connect very closely with professionals in the MHPSS field. So many of you, I think, know already about the work that IJR has done in this regard. We started with an Inception Conference almost 5 years ago, where we asked practitioners and academics from around the world, do you think this is necessary? And everybody resoundingly said yes. People traveled from around the world at fairly short notice to be at the conference, and there was this profound sense that we needed to come together. Though we didn't really know how we were going to do things once we did get together. So my colleagues Marion Tankink, Yvonne Sleep, and myself started drafting a research agenda, which ultimately resulted in a literature review, a mapping study, a special issue of the journal Intervention, and also an expert reference group, which sort of advises us and feeds into the work that we're doing. This is all available on the IJR website, and you're welcome to email me if you have any difficulties in downloading it. What started in 2019 of the last year is a series of co-creation workshops, which took place in South Africa, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. And this was a really, really exciting process. The co-creation workshops were conceptualized at an expert meeting last year and are really underpinned by the notion that if we're going to do this together, we need to imagine it together. And so we brought together practitioners from both fields in these 3 countries, individuals from a huge range of MHPSS affiliated professions and a range of peace building affiliated professions. The meetings were inclusive, they were participatory, they encouraged vulnerability, which we felt was really important. So in the spaces that we were in during the meetings, we encouraged people to share their personal stories, to tell us how they got to this work, why they're so passionate about it. And that, of course, contributed significantly to the relationships that were built during these meetings, which in turn strengthens the collaboration. We felt it was really important that we learn about one another with one another. So rather than learning about another field on our own, we felt that it was important that we had somebody in the room that we could say to, but how do you understand this or that concept or that particular event? There's also enabled the surfacing of cultural and contextual nuances. So obviously the context in South Africa was very different to Kenya and to Zimbabwe. And we felt as a result of this, and we'll be publishing a report about this early next year, that regular, structured and interdisciplinary dialogue is an important core foundation for a professional rapprochement between the fields. We need to keep talking to one another. While I think a webinar like this is amazing, I think the talking does ideally need to happen face-to-face, because that vulnerability and that real connection that happens when people can look each other in the eyes is really important. So what have we found in terms of the challenges to integration and collaboration? And these are questions, of course, that we've asked people in the spaces that we've been in during the co-creation workshops. So very, very simply, there is a lack of knowledge about the other field and how it works. And an anecdote that really works for me is somebody in Zimbabwe saying, but we often refer individuals that we're working with as peace builders to our friends who work as psychologists, for instance, with torture survivors. And then the psychologist said, but do you know what we do with that individual? Do you know what happens? And of course, then there was a blank drawn on the other side. And I think that's really powerful in terms of not knowing what happens behind that referral door. And I think the same is the case when an individual is then released, so to speak, or sent back into the community. What happens? What do we as peace builders do to then sustain that individual and make sure that he or she is able to sort of reintegrate into that social fabric? There are incredible mutual stereotypes and misconceptions about one another, which of course is linked to a lack of knowledge. There are very strong silos, and there's quite a lot of protectionism between the fields. And I think some of that might be related to fear of not knowing, or fear of sort of treading on the toes or the fields of another field, of another discipline. There is, of course, competition for resources. I know this is something you're all familiar with, whether it's working in MHPSS or Peacebuilding, never mind us all working together. And what we've been finding more recently is that donors don't fund this work and are unfamiliar with this concept of integration and tend to want quick fixes. And this is not a quick fix, because we do need to work together in the long term in order to enhance this rapprochement between the two fields. There is an interesting perception, and I'm finding this a lot on the African continent, that MHPSS affects women and children and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence, but not everyone. So the African Union, for instance, recently published a transitional justice policy, and in that policy, references to mental health were made almost exclusively to women and children and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence. And this, of course, negates the fact or ignores the fact that violent conflict affects absolutely everybody, and hence any intervention needs to be targeted at everybody. We also know that there is stigma around mental health and psychosocial support and mental health needs in many countries around the world. How do we address that? That's, I think, is a long journey we need to embark on. And then how do we build on local cultural practices that could complement an integrated approach? And I think this is really, really exciting. This is particularly exciting for me on the African continent, where there is quite a lot of pushback in terms of Western ideas, methodologies, and concepts that are being imposed onto communities and societies that don't necessarily identify with the way in which this is presented. So how can we challenge that? And I'll propose something in a little while. We also need knowledge production and research in the global south, but in Africa in particular. And that's what I was alluding to just now, is we do not yet have sufficient research and understanding of what mental health looks like on the African continent, and it isn't sufficiently documented, accessible globally. This is really something we need to work on. Context specificity is really, really important. We know that a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work in any post-conflict setting. So we have found that there are tremendous differences in how a co-creation workshop might look and it might generate in Zimbabwe to the way it would be here in South Africa. And then finally, how do globally accepted terms translate into local contexts and languages? What is, oops, my presentation is skipping. How, feels like there's a ghost on my screen. How do we translate trauma, mental health, depression, social cohesion, reconciliation, these terms that exist in English and in English are defined in terms of international norms and standards, but how do they translate into the nuances of local cultural, political, historical contexts? So finally, how do we imagine an integrated approach? And I think it's really important that we begin to imagine, and I quite like the word imagine, because we are very much at the start of this. I'm excited that there's so many of you here that are already doing this work, and I would like to beg you all to connect with us and share with us your experience, your challenges, your successes, and I'm really excited that Patrick is going to speak after me in a moment, because I think there's some really, really exciting work been happening in TP Uganda, in northern Uganda. But we're quite desperate, I think, for case studies from around the world to show us how the two fields can work together more closely. So this imagining, I think one of the key elements is that we get to know one another. We need to demystify ourselves to one another. We need to talk about what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. And this is what I was referring to earlier on as happening in the co-creation workshops. And we hope to be doing a lot more of that kind of work in the future. We need to build on commonalities, which hinges on first identifying commonalities. There are a lot, and they've been coming up at our co-creation workshops. So can we nurture a culture of collaboration between the silos while also protecting the investments that each field has made? So we're not saying we need to give up our specificities, our specific expertises and these investments that we've made, but can we work together to build on that which we have in common and to share that amongst the disciplines? Building an evidence base that points to improved outcomes for each field as a result of collaboration and integration, I think, is really important. And in a sense, I'm referring again to Patrick's work in northern Uganda. This, I think, is one of the first projects that shows us that when we work with people's psychological well-being, when we address their psychosocial needs in the context of conflict resolution, conflict transformation, and peace building, then the ripple effects societally are tremendous. But we need more projects of this scale, of this nature, in different countries, in different contexts, in order to build that evidence base that says that integration is really important. Something that I think is really important as well is to calculate the cost of not collaborating and integrating. So what happens when we implement peace building projects without also addressing the psychosocial needs of people, their psychological pains related to the past? What does that mean for our peace building interventions, for our projects, for our outcomes? And I think that is quite tremendous. That cost is huge, and we have some evidence already from organizations around the world that indicate that peace building cannot be done when people's trauma hasn't been addressed and people are continuing to live with those memories of the past. Similarly, I think it's just as important to calculate the benefits of integrating, and I think that's where the evidence base comes in. We found in our grappling with whether we should be integrating or collaborating is that collaboration is the bridge to an integrated approach. So what needs to happen first is for us as organizations to get to know one another, to work together, to familiarize ourselves and one another with the terms, the concepts, the methodologies, the theories of change. And once that happens, we will, I imagine, hopefully in my lifetime still, understand that we absolutely need to work together in order to achieve sustainable peace. And ultimately, what I'd very much like to see is that no peace building graduate qualifies from any university anywhere in the world without having a very solid understanding of the psychological impact of conflict on individuals and how to address that. And similarly for MHPSS individuals to understand that once people have been healed and are in the process of recovery, that they are much more likely to contribute to peace building processes and the reweaving of society. And I think constructing interdisciplinary teams to conceptualize, implement, and evaluate this work is really important. This issue of interdisciplinarity, I think, is key. It's something that is increasingly popular around the world, not only between these two fields, but globally. We are understanding that we need one another, that we need different ways of thinking and theorizing and understanding things in order to generate the kinds of outcomes that are needed. And then something that has been coming up as well as at a lot of the workshops is, can we ensure that peace builders themselves have addressed their own trauma prior to working in this field? So have we embarked on our own sort of social transformation process, personal transformation process in order to make us as individuals better practitioners in this field? So that is me. I'm hoping that I haven't taken too much time, but I haven't heard Marcia cut me off yet. I'd like to encourage you all to note any questions that you might have in the chat. We might not get to all of them, but they are very, very helpful in furthering this field, and we take them very, very seriously. Any ideas, suggestions, links, questions, concerns, disagreements, please post them in the chat, and that'll be really, really helpful to furthering this work. So thank you very much, and back to you, Marcio.
Thank you very much, Frederica. I just want to double check that people can hear me. Yeah, that's super. Thank you very much. My apologies for this time to tech. I think we are sorted now with that problem. And I want to invite everyone to start posting your question. Do post your question at the chat box. My colleagues at MHPSS.net are collecting them, and then after Patrick's presentation, we are going to have a question and answer session. Patrick, can you mute your microphone while I put your presentation up? Hello, Patrick. It seems that Patrick is not around. Just 1 minute. Let us sort out to see what happened to Patrick.
Hi, Marcio, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Oh, good.
Thank
you, Patrick.
Can I go ahead now?
Yes, you can go ahead. Your presentation is up. Thank you very much.
All right. Hi, Marcio. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining the webinar today. My name is Patrick Onyango Mangen, and I work with TPO Uganda here in Kampala. Thanks, Federica, for the presentation on the peace building part of the presentation. My presentation will be sharing a project that we've been implementing over the past 3 years in northern Uganda. As many of you might be aware, northern Uganda suffered a history of conflict. And so what we're looking at in this project is to see how we can combine trauma healing, peace building, and livelihood support intervention, collectively rebuilding community systems for conflict resolution. And so, like Federica mentioned, I'll speak a lot more as largely my background and how we have integrated the peace building aspect into this work. So the title of the presentation is addressing post-conflict trauma through conflict resolution and economic empowerment activities in Uganda. As I mentioned, the project has been going on for 3 years now. And these are the main issues that are being addressed. This is the context in which the project is situated. First of all, we're looking at attending to the unattended traumatic experiences. Communities went through decades of conflict. A lot of atrocities were committed on individuals and family. And so presently, you're looking at a context where there is a lot of mistrust. Everybody mistrusts the other, even though they're from the same community. There's a lot of suspicion, as well as belligerent attitudes in relationships. And we're finding, when we did the baseline survey for this project, we found the community support structures, which would normally have supported reconciliation and peace building, was also largely weakened. And so traditional conflict resolution mechanisms are non-existent. And we found in the baseline that it was important to first re-establish these community structures so that communities can coexist. We're also supporting the formal structures to coexist with the informal processes. The formal processes include civil litigation, working through the courts of law, and those kind of structures. Whereas the informal structures are largely led by traditional peace building mechanisms and so on, also on and so forth. As a result of the conflict and years of deprivation, there are lots of people who are aggrieved over access to resources, aggrieved over land issues and different conflicts. And so we are finding that parties are tending to courts of law. Whereas that is encouraged, we find that it doesn't necessarily foster peaceful coexistence and community harmony. Because once you go to a court of law, it is assumed there's going to be a winner and there will be a loser, and yet you have to stay in the same community. We're also seeing high levels of vulnerabilities among the youth. Youth had several missed opportunities to complete their education, to engage in productive activity. And so we're seeing many people, young people, engaging in exploitative relationships, as well as high-risk behavior. The inability for families to meet basic needs, which is resulting into high levels of stress and disputes. Sexual gender exploitation is quite rife. In the baseline survey, we saw that 71% of the households interviewed had difficulties with coping with their present environment and psychologically coping with the situation, not only being able to fend for themselves and meeting their economic needs. At least 3 every persons we interviewed manifested symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety disorders, and so forth. And so for us, when we're designing this project, we looked at how do we address these psychological difficulties first. And we're basing on the hypothesis that communities and individuals cannot be expected to engage in meaningful reconciliation and peace building until any thoughts of vengeance or revenge are removed from their minds. And later on, I'll be talking about how we're using psychosocial approaches to deal with those feelings of vengeance and isolation and so on. Conflict analysis also considers land disputes as the most common drivers of post-conflict violence in Uganda. And like I mentioned, because the traditional system has been broken, people are resorting to police, people are resorting to courts. But also, in some situations, we've seen mob justice coming up. Young people are taking the law into their arms and reaching out to seek revenge and cause difficulties for those who might have wronged them. But I just have to mention that coping behaviors such as isolation, alcohol abuse, aggressive outbursts, physical and psychological violence are quite widespread in the system, in the community. And so this project is looking at how do we support positive coping, or even being able to have families manage to rebuild some of these broken systems that traditionally supported them. So what are we seeing as part of an integrated approach? From a psychosocial point, we see that psychosocial interventions can set a strong foundation for conflict resolution. They focus on the mind, they focus on healing, like Federica mentioned, and they focus on assuaging vengeful thoughts and intentions from an individual. Until communities, individuals remove these thoughts from their minds, they cannot engage in meaningful relationships. They can also not engage in meaningful productive activity. And so including economic development interventions curtails any risks of relapse arising from deep thought. We come across households when we're doing these community outreach programs where families, individuals are just sitting and looking out in the sky. They are looking out and they are engrossed in deep thought. They have nothing to start from. And that's where an external intervention such as this project regrets over missed opportunities. Let's not underestimate missed opportunities, whether it's a 15-year-old who should have completed primary level 3 when they were 10 years, whether it's a 20-year-old who is looking for admission into a university and they cannot get it. These missed opportunities are depriving young people, especially, of proper occupational functioning. Conflict transformation and social reconstruction are only possible if trauma symptoms are treated and coping skills are improved and enhanced. We talked a bit about the coping. We're seeing a lot of negative coping among individuals, especially young people. And this is a context of poverty, a context of HIV/AIDS, and a context which hasn't fully recovered from the conflict and the after effects of the conflict. The counseling session, the specific MHPSS interventions here are highly clinical, but we also use people-to-people approaches as far as peace building. MHPSS pyramid, some of you might be familiar with the pyramid. We start from the level 1, which is the social support level. We move upwards. Those who cannot cope eventually find their way through a referral system and are able to get clinical treatment. So the counseling sessions, for example, would include psychoeducative treatment, and these we have seen help people to cope with their traumatic experiences and also recover from daily stressors, but also build good social relations. And so the other intervention we provide is group focused treatment such as cognitive behavior therapy. We're also introducing problem management plus on lower level of the pyramid. And these CBT, bringing 12 individuals into a group, has had numerous unintended outcomes. In a group, you're removing the isolation, you're dealing with issues of trauma, you're dealing with the relational abilities among individuals. And some women and men have come to us and said, I didn't know I would be able to make friends anymore. I'm making new friends in this group. And so we take the group participants and we link them to the economic empowerment activity by training them in business development skills, by giving them startup support for those who cannot afford to contribute, but on condition that these economic empowerment groups are 70% supported by the project, and the beneficiaries contribute about 30% of this. And those are the effects of CBT, peer support, creating spaces for reflection. We're seeing group members coming together, even where the session is not planned. And when the session is not planned, they meet under a mango tree, they meet under a shade, and all they do is talk among themselves. And CBT in particular, the session on stress management and psychoeducation has enabled victims to acquire better coping skills. Some of the take-home assignments that individuals take after the CBT session are quite helpful to them. But also their family members begin seeing recovery. And so we're getting overwhelming numbers beyond our targets. The family members are seeing recovery, community people are seeing recovery, and they're asking, where are you going? And they're saying, we're going to this place and we're talking about these issues and we're having these 10-step sessions. It has a challenge for us because we're not resourced enough to meet all the needs in the community. And so we would be encouraging a lot more actors to come in here. We're working with Frederica, Yvonne, and Marian to see if we can organize a workshop in the coming year and pull together additional organizations that are able to do this kind of work. And the last point is the people-to-people approaches, peer-to-peer education. We have found this to be quite effective as far as reconciling people, bringing people together, and allowing people to form their own destiny and to decide on how they want to reconcile. Do they want to go to court? Maybe not. Do they want to go to that? Or they just want to have community meetings? And so the people-to-people approaches are proving quite effective. And today, and the report has been posted by Federico on the platform. I would encourage you to read it because it kind of takes you through the whole trajectory from peace building, psychosocial and mental health support, and livelihoods, and how all those three integrate. Family mediation is extremely important. So our field staff do a lot of family mediation, just going to families and talking to them, identifying the trigger points of conflict and dealing with those before they get out of hand, dealing with those before somebody takes a decision either to go to a local court, to go to the police, or to just speak to a neighbor. And so we have adopted these people-to-people approaches, and that's my main emphasis as far as encouraging a negotiated harmony. Thank you all for your attention, and thank you, the moderators, for the session.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? All right, super. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties again this time. We are now going to move for the final part of our webinar, which is the questions and answers. So if you haven't posted your question yet, you can do it. In the chat box. Unfortunately, things got frozen here for me, and I cannot see at all the questions that was posted before. The chat got completely cleared. But Frederic, you are able
fine, Marcio.
to read that, right? Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead,
Yes,
Armand.
Marcio, we have posted the questions to Frederica. Frederica, they are in the moderator chat. I wonder if you might be able to just unmute and respond to the three that we have from, Carmen and Patricia, perhaps to begin with.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, everybody. These are interesting questions, and I should start by saying that I don't have all the answers. Carmen, your question about the gendered aspect of this particular context is quite interesting. I remember very well from the literature review that we conducted a few years back. We published it in 2018, and we conducted it in 2017, that there was a definite shortage on how gender sort of is positioned within this nexus between MHPSS and peace building. And I agree with you, and I think my reference to the AU Transitional Justice Policy is quite interesting in the sense that we have here a document which is drafted in a fairly patriarchal context, drafted predominantly by men, and for a very male context. And here we already see the results of it being targeted specifically at women and children. What I do think is really important if we're going to address this is we need to address the stigma around mental health and how it relates around gender issues. And I think one of the ways in which this can be done is by finding champions who are willing to sort of take on this work and bring people into this realm. And I remember very clearly a fantastic gentleman by the name of Paul Boyle doing this work in South Sudan as a man working with men to talk about how being ex-combatants in the conflict in South Sudan had impacted on men psychologically. And what emerged very quickly was that men, when they were amongst men, were quite happy to talk about these issues and felt such a relief as a result of having a space in which they could talk, that they very quickly sort of spoke about it with other men. And so in this way, that was tackled. But I think we need a lot more research on how we can break down the stereotypes. I think there's an interesting sort of complexity around gender and stigma and a lack of understanding, and that I think is something we need far more research, knowledge, and action around. There was a question as well around whether we should be translating these global concepts to local languages or the other way around. I definitely think that the starting point to doing this kind of work in any context, and we learned this in all of the countries we've worked in, even I as a, in this case, white South African, had to learn quite a lot about how these issues are perceived, lived and experienced in Black communities here in South Africa, is a starting point needs to be knowledge and understanding and research about how people are living with things that we in the Western world might call depression, anxiety, and so forth, how they are defined, how they are lived out, who the support systems are, what resilience structures they are. And once we have that understanding, then we can begin to address these issues. And I think what is also really important is that we bring a variety of stakeholders into that conversation. Bring in church leaders, bring in traditional leaders, and various other leadership structures and support structures in community to really get a sense of how what we, and I'm putting we in inverted commas, as outsiders might bring into a context. I really think that the starting point needs to be a thorough understanding of how these issues are lived out. But I don't have a definitive answer, and I'd love to have a conversation with you about how you perceive this and what you think your questions are, what your solutions might be, especially around the issue around power. And I think that's really, really important, the north-south power dynamics that we're so familiar with. I'm going to, there was another mention of the African, on the AU Transitional Justice Policy, and what would I suggest would be added to the policy to strengthen it. To be honest, I think it needs to be mainstreamed throughout. I think it needs a separate section that speaks to the psychological legacy of conflict, unaffected communities on the African continent. It needs to prioritize the fact that impacts on everybody equally, not disproportionately on vulnerable groups. So it needs to be much positioned in a far stronger way that acknowledges a much bigger impact of conflict on individuals. So unfortunately, I would suggest that the policy is rewritten in a sense from an MHPSS perspective. There is an interesting question that I'll read out and not respond to at this point. It would be important to understand the theoretical background on the need to address PSS-related issues as an enabling factor to work on peace building. How's that done? What is different from standard psychosocial support? What are the nuances that need to be taken into account, and especially within each context based on experience? I'm going to hand over to Patrick here because I'm not entirely sure how to answer this question. I'm going to give it a think, and if I come up with a coherent answer, I'll do that after Patrick has spoken. But I think there are a few questions for Patrick as well now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Patrick, it's all yours.
Yeah, thanks, Frederica. I see a question here from Leah. Thank you all for these questions. Leah is talking about something we frequently encountered, that most of the trainees actually have their own trauma carried forward from the conflict, which is true. And I would also just want to add that many of these trainees actually do live within the same community and culture where this trauma was inflicted. And what we have introduced into all our programs operating in post-conflict communities and contexts is a Care for Humanitarian Workers program. We're trying to develop this program. Their colleagues, so Alexis is was on the group on the webinar. But we have realized the importance of supporting our trainees, our field staff, overcome their own traumas before we expect them to support others. And there are positive outcomes of this approach. It's included in our Care for Caregivers program. Angie had two questions. Thanks for these questions, Angie. How do the peer-to-peer discussions relate to the people-to-people approach? People approach. They very similar experiences, or could be groups of families that have come together to take care of orphans or missing children and that kind of those kind of issues. And people-to-people approaches are probably much broader because they also include communities, bringing all community structures together to discuss and talk about how they can deal with these issues. I posted, there is a paragraph that talks about this peer-to-peer, people-to-people approaches. Have we found any links? This is another question from Angie. Have we found any links between peace-building cycle of violence and its impact, and the impact MHPSS of working with both victims and those who had others, sometimes different groups? I'm not entirely conversant with this, but from our own experience, from the experience of this project, it is difficult to have the perpetrators come out directly, those who you refer to as those who have hurt others. It is difficult to have them come up directly to seek support. So we assume many of these come through different channels, or we encounter them during the course of our work. I would just like to pause there for now and see if there. I don't know much about that area of work, and may not be.
Just 1 minute, Frederick, just to let people know that some people, they have to leave. My colleagues, they will post the link to the exit survey. So before you leave, or just straight after you leave, we kindly ask you to respond to the survey. It's very quick and it's very informative for us to improve our webinars as well. Yes, go ahead, Frederick, it's all yours.
Yeah, I just sort of wanted to, I think the question around the relationship between the notion of the cycle of violence in the peace building field impacting on the MHPSS field is really interesting in the sense that it questions the notion of sequencing. So at which point does who impact on what, and at which point do we enter in order to break the cycle of violence. And for me, I think the priority here needs to be, and this is partially why I'm challenging the transitional justice policy of the AU, is that I think that at the very outset, if not already while conflict is ongoing and we see that there's an end to a conflict coming, these structures need to be put into place in order to begin to break the cycles of violence. And I think in that process, both MHPSS practitioners and peace builders can come on board that conversation and those actions at the same time. I think what we're trying to argue for here is that they are part of the same conversation at the same time at the outset, so that there aren't two different conversations, there aren't different funds, there aren't different practitioners, but that from the outset we are saying South Sudan has now reached a peace agreement, for lack of a different example. How do we make sure that the cycles of violence which we've seen here are addressed? How do we make sure that peace builders contribute sustainably and effectively to breaking those cycles of violence, and how can we work with MHPSS practitioners? And similarly, so it's really one hand washes the other in that process. But I think the question of sequencing is really important, and I think it's particularly important that as we embark on this work, that this synchronizing and this working together, the collaboration is documented so that we know at what point this work is most impactful. There was another comment about co-creation workshops and what ways have been particularly useful in managing the different assumptions that fields have of one another. And I think, as I said earlier on, the most important thing is to bring people together and have these conversations with one another, with good facilitators. So we need to challenge assumptions, and we live in a world of assumptions about one another, and we live in times of immense pressure and the need for deliverables and outputs and outcomes. And so a lot of the time it's quite easy to sort of say, oh yes, I understand this, that makes perfect sense. But to really sit and grapple with what these things mean, to really understand why stereotypes exist, where they've been born from, how these misconceptions about one another have developed, and then to sort of tackle them head on. I think that sort of sitting together and understanding the way we work, why we do the work we do, and how we do it is absolutely critical to that.
Thank you very much, Frederica. Patrick, would you have any additional comment? And I would go for a last round of comments from the two of you, and then we will start concluding. We already shared the link to the exit survey. Please, for people that will leave, that start leaving, do go ahead and before you leave, just click the link and answer our survey. There are a few questions related to this webinar, if this is being recorded. Yes, this is being recorded, and will be posted at our MHPSS.net website as well, at the YouTube channel, MHPSS.net YouTube channel. So it's going to be there. Patrick, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Marcio. I just to add on to what Frederica said, and I say, as we look for the intersection between peace building and MHPSS, I think would kind of extend this to collaborations between agencies involved in this kind of work. And as somebody mentioned also in Frederica's presentation, the silo-based approach is quite commonplace in the field. You find a peace building program just focusing on peace building and nothing else. And then the MHPSS program. And so for me, I'm hoping this is the beginning of something more interesting, collaborations between individuals, but also collaborations in jointly coming up to work around common program areas of concern. And I can only encourage all of us to try and see whatever literature is out there, which is not a lot, that we can use to continue building this work and taking it forward. But I appreciate everyone for the participation, and thank you, Marcio.
Thanks to you, Patrick. Frederica.
Yeah, thank you. I think for me the key thing is that we continue working on this together, and that we continue to build together this community of knowledge and practice, and that individuals share this work. I also would really like to, and I sound like a TPO advocate here, but I really would like to encourage people to read the Peace Starts with Peace of Mind report, because I think there are anecdotes in there from community members who've been beneficiaries of this one version of an integrated approach, which are incredibly powerful. Having worked in northern Uganda myself, and sort of hearing individuals speak about how they were unable to participate in some of the initiatives that I've even been part of in northern Uganda, peacebuilding and justice and reconciliation initiatives. Now, looking back on those processes, understanding that as a result of the MHPSS processes that they've gone through, they can now participate in those activities in an entirely different way. So for me, that's really exciting, and anybody who's interested in this, I think, should go and have a look at that report, because I think it's really solid evidence for the fact that individuals themselves who are beneficiaries of this work find it so helpful. But I also just want to encourage everybody to keep in touch with us. Email us your insights, your knowledge, your questions, because we are starting to build something new, and we need all hands on deck on this process. And I'm really excited by how many people attended today. And thank you everybody for your great questions and your participation.
Thank you so much, Frederica. So I think despite the technical issues we had today, we had an amazing presentation, very clarifying. I want to note everyone that we have a group at MHPSS.net dedicated to MHPSS and peacebuilding. So I encourage people to join this group. It's where we concentrated the resources related to this discussion and this topic. Frederica and Patrick, once again, thank you so much for your collaboration, your participation at this webinar. We very much appreciate it. This is going to be surely an ongoing discussion. So let's see how next year we can integrate a new webinar on topic. We had a very impressive number of people interested in this webinar. More than 200 people, they registered for this webinar from all over the world. We had about up to 90, 100 persons participating today, which is just showing us how people, they feel they are interested in this topic, and they want to see the collaboration and the integration of MHPSS and peacebuilding initiatives. This webinar is being recorded. It will be posted at our website, so keep going there. In the next few days, you should be informed that the link to this webinar will be posted there. And thank you, everyone, for participating, for your time. Please go ahead, do answer our survey, our final survey evaluating this webinar. We very much appreciate everyone's participation, now the MHPSS.net team as well, that has been around solving problems and supporting the initiative, supporting the webinar as well. And see you next time.